Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we are going to be sowing some of our hardy annuals. If you remember in the last video I was starting to sow our perennial stock and I said I was holding off slightly on sowing hardy annuals. Well, now is the time that I've actually started with certain varieties to sow our hardy annuals. These are annual plants that produce flowers for one season. So in this scenario, they're going to be producing flowers for summer 2026. If you haven't picked the flowers go over, they set seed, and that's them done with. You might be lucky if they're like your soil conditions, they might well self-sow and germinate in your soil, and then you'll get a succession of flowers the following season. But that's if they're like your ground. That's not the same plant coming back. It's the seed that's been dropped from the previous year's plants. So these are hardy annual seed. So they're hardy, meaning that they'll go through the winter, and they're annual, meaning that they'll flower for one season. Now, if you get a hold of some seed packets or are searching online about how to sow hardy annuals for overwintering, a lot of the advice will be to sow between August and September, and that's totally correct. But what the seed packets haven't got the space to tell you, and sometimes what's missed out in information online a little bit, is I actually categorise within the hardy annual bracket. So I see that there's 3 different types of hardy annuals when it comes to sowing and germination, and they need to be sown at different points and at different temperatures. So firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the hardy annuals that I'm definitely not going to be sowing today, and they fall into the Susie branded category of the super fast hardy annuals. So they're things like cornflower, cinnaglossum, calendula, gypsophilia Covent Garden, saponora, and there will be more as well that I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're just some examples. Now, those hardy annuals are super quick to germinate, and the chances are that with those guys, if we sow them too early, they might try to come into flower. As I touched on in the last video, that's what we don't want to happen at this time of year. We don't want any of these seeds that we're starting to sow now to try and come into flower, because like I said, the flower stems will be wispy and weedy and just not good quality. So what we're sowing for now is for next season. So I deliberately avoid sowing the super fast hardy annuals until certainly the back end of August here, just to ensure that they're not going to burst into flower. So I'm going to leave those for a few weeks yet. And then there's another group within the hardy annual category that I'm not going to be sowing today, and they're the hardy annuals that like it cool, and they just will not germinate in these temperatures we're getting at the minute. So it's best to hold off those until the temperature, certainly on an evening, starts to drop a little bit more than it is at the minute, because otherwise they just won't germinate. They'll sit dormant, and if you were to sow them at this time of year and you would continue and watering them hoping for signs of germination, the likelihood is that those seeds would rot off, and then you've just wasted a whole load of money on seeds that are never going to germinate. And the 2 definites that I would avoid sowing yet are larkspur and buplorum, because these 2 seeds will actively go dormant in these temperatures, and they like to germinate at around about the 16-degree mark. And even on a night time here, we're still over 15 degrees currently. So it's just too hot to germinate those 2 varieties of seeds, in my opinion, at the minute. So what I've done with those seed packets is I've opened the seed packets up, which will expose the seeds to moisture, and I've put them into my fridge. And they'll sit there for around about 3 to 4 weeks until the temperatures have dropped to a slightly cooler temperature to enable that seed to germinate. But the varieties that I am currently sowing, and I have been sowing on the bench behind me there, are the hardy annuals that germinate and grow in a more slow and steady manner. So what have I been sowing? I've been sowing Ami, Magus and Visnaga. I've also been sowing Nigella. I've started sowing our gathered Orlea seed and Dorcas, and then finally I've sown an awful lot of snapdragons. So I get asked quite a lot about the cell trays and compost that I use for sowing, so I'll just touch on that quickly for you. I use peat-free compost. I use Bulrush Professional Multi-Purpose Compost, and it has wood fibres in it rather than too much coir. And that's the compost there. I'm sure you'll see it many a time in the seed trays when I sow into it. This compost has been brilliant for me in terms of germination. I've had some absolute nightmares with compost. I know bad compost exists. You can look back to, I think it was January this year when I did a compost video about the trials and tribulations of some of the compost that's on the market at the minute. But currently I am sticking with bulrush because it's been absolutely fabulous. I've had some great results. It is very fibrous, which I know a lot of you have picked up on in the videos. So this is the compost. It's bulrush multi-purpose, peat-free, as I said. It's manufactured in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. I don't think they ship worldwide, so I'm sorry if you're watching from somewhere else in the world. But it might be interesting to see anyway. This is what they replace a lot of the peat with. It's exploded wood fibre. And I know a lot of you have picked up on this stuff when you've seen it in videos. That's the very fibrous compound that you can see when I'm sowing into the compost close up. And they've used this stuff instead of using so much coir, and it's sourced locally to the factory where they manufacture the compost itself. So it sits a little bit better with me in my head in terms of sustainability. And that's what you're seeing in the videos when you're looking at the close-ups. It's really good stuff. Like I say, it's really light. I'm sure you can see it's really light and fluffy and airy. So it's great for seed germination. So that's the compost that I'm sowing into. And so what do I actually sow into as a pot tray? Well, this is going to be really specific to me and the needs of Picked at Dawn and our customers. So we produce plug plants here. And because a lot of people like our plug plants, thank you, I've had to step up production a lot because I've been looking for a site with glass houses and things to move to, which will give us more space, but I can't find one at the minute. So we trialled a different method this spring and it seemed to work. So we're going to be sowing all of our more slow and steady germinating seeds into these, which are 150 cell trays. So you can see it's got 150 little holes in there. And you can see there, should be able to see there probably, it's got really big aeration holes at the bottom of it. Now this is brilliant because plant roots hate to be trapped and hate not having oxygen to them, so they've got really big holes at the bottom. And then all of these plants, 150 of them, have to be popped out and potted into our 54 cell trays. So you can see the difference in size there, because that's the cell tray size that we sell our plug plants in. A lot of cells in that in that sentence. And that's also the size that I would recommend planting annuals out into your garden or field in. So currently we have to do quite a lot of potting on. So for that purpose, thankfully, these are made by Quick Pot in Germany, I should say, and I'm not on any kickback for saying that. It just happens to be the manufacturer, and I suspect that a lot of you are going to ask about that. They also manufacture these popper boards, and that is brilliant because these have all got to be potted on. And when it gets to that point, what we do is put them on the popper board and it will push all the plants up. I've got a popper board for the 54 cells, and that's how the popper board works, in the same way for this 150 cell tray. Now these trays are really pricey compared to some on the market, and you have to buy them in bulk. They say that they'll recommend them for 10-year use, but I've had these for a lot longer than 10 years now. So now I'm going to show you what I've been sowing and how I've been sowing it this week. So first off, I've been sowing the snapdragons, and I've sown 2,500 seeds of each. So that was a heck of a lot of sowing because snapdragon seed is absolutely tiny. So both Ami Magus and Ami Bisnaga seeds are of a reasonable size, and I can tend to sow them with my fingers. I simply put a few seeds in my fingertips and then rub them, and I don't know if I've got overly sensitive fingers, but I can feel as the seeds drop. And I drop between 2 and 3 seeds in per cell. Nigella again is a sort of average size seed, and I'm able to sow that in the same way as Ami, just by rubbing the seeds between my fingers, dropping about 3 seeds in per cell. And Nigella I don't thin at all because it absolutely hates root disturbance. Therefore I'd recommend dropping about 3 seeds per cell, and just leaving them to grow on as a clump rather than disturbing them. Orlea is a really big chunky seed which most people would find quite easy to sow. I put 2 seeds in per cell and they can take up to a month to germinate. After I've initially watered Orlea, one little trick that I've got is they like to be allowed to go slightly dry. That doesn't mean that I let the seed tray dry out completely. It just means you have to be careful with Orlea not to kill it with kindness and not to overwater the seeds. So none of those varieties are going to bolt into flower and give you any problems that way. But with the exception of Orlea, all of these varieties should germinate within 7 to 10 days. Orlea can take anything up to a month to germinate. That's why we start them off so early in the season. This stuff, as horrible as it looks, and this stuff, which doesn't look like much at all, really helps the germination process at this time of year. So the grand reveal, there you go, little baby snapdragons. As you can see there, that is Potomac orange. These were only revealed from the cotton sheet yesterday, and these are all our snapdragons, which go right the way down. So after it's germinated under the cotton blanket, then you switch to I switch to Enviro Mesh. So you can see there all the Nigella growing along quite happily underneath the Enviro Mesh, and it's light enough not to put too much pressure on the plant. This is 7 days after sowing it on the Ami Visnaga. This here is all the Dorcas. That was actually sown a bit earlier, so that's actually been sown 2 weeks ago. So this here is an Orlea seedling, and you can see here how dry the compost is. That's because I'm only watering the Orlea seedlings every other day. All the other plants are getting watered every day, but Orlea will germinate better if you let it have a little day where it kind of has to struggle. So I'm just going to cover these guys up now until they've got a couple of sets of leaves on them, and then they're fully rooted into these size cell trays, and then at that point they'll get popped out and potted on into our 54 cell trays. By that point they'll be nice, strong, chunky plants and ready for the next stage of their life, either ready for someone to pop them on and overwinter them, or plant them straight into their soil, dependent on their soil conditions. But all of these varieties are fully hardy, so you don't have to worry about frost or cold damage or anything like that. They'd all overwinter outside perfectly happily, be that in a pot or in the ground. So there we go. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'm going to escape this tunnel now before it starts getting too warm. I'll see you next week.